The smell of incense was still clinging to my hands when Hong said it. Right there in front of everyone. In the room where my husband's photograph watched us all from the altar. She's just a teacher. She won't know the difference. She didn't whisper it. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather, loud enough for the appraiser to hear, loud enough for my son Duke to hear, loud enough for the cousins gathered around the lunch table to hear, and loud enough, apparently, for her to forget that I was standing 6 feet away, with a teapot in my hand. The appraiser, a thin man named Kai, with a mustache, he kept touching like it might fall off, glanced at me nervously. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. Hong did not. I had spent 35 years standing in front of classrooms full of 17-year-olds who thought they could pass notes without me noticing, who thought their whispered jokes during my lectures on Truyang Kyo were too quiet for an old woman's ears. I had built a career on noticing things, on hearing the things people thought they were saying quietly enough. So I heard her. I set the teapot down on the tray. My hand did not shake. I want that understood clearly, because everyone in that room expected it to shake, expected my face to crumple, expected the predictable performance of an old widow being hurt by her own family. I gave them none of that. Instead, I smiled. Just slightly. One corner of my mouth, the way I used to smile at a student who'd given a clever but wrong answer, the kind of smile that says I heard you, and I am choosing, for now, to let you keep talking. Duke looked at me, confused. He'd expected tears. Maybe. Or anger. What he got instead was his mother pouring tea, like nothing at all had happened. Humming the same tune I'd hummed every afternoon since his father died. 8 years now. The tune I used to sing, while grading papers at the kitchen table, with the radio playing low. Nobody understood the smile. I watched it land wrong on every face in the room, confusion on Duke's, irritation on Hong's, relief on Kai's, because he assumed it meant I hadn't understood what was being decided about my own land. Let them think that. Let them all think, whatever made them comfortable enough to keep talking without watching their words. I have learned, in 68 years, that the most dangerous thing you can do to people who underestimate you is nothing at all. You let the silence do the work. You let them fill it with their own carelessness. But to understand why I smiled, instead of breaking, to understand how a woman could hear her son's wife call her too foolish to recognize fraud, and not so much as blink, you would have to go back, not just to that afternoon with the teapot and the appraiser and the smell of jasmine tea going cold on the tray. Further back than that. 3 months back, to be exact, to the morning Hong first brought up the subject of the land survey, smiling the whole time, calling me mother in that voice she used when she wanted something. Further back still, to the year my husband died and left me the house and the land registered jointly in both our names, a piece of paper that meant nothing to anyone in that room except me, because I was the only one who remembered what it had cost us to buy that land, what years we'd gone without new clothes, without a refrigerator, without anything but rice and vegetables, just so that piece of earth would belong to us and, someday, to our children. And further back even than that, to my own mother, sitting on the porch of our old house in the Delta, when I was 19 years old, and engaged to be married, telling me something I had never forgotten, something that came back to me now, standing in my own living room with the smell of incense in my hair, and my daughter-in-law's voice still ringing in my ears. Nuk so tilang, my mother had said. Still water runs deepest. She'd meant it as advice about choosing a husband, about not trusting the men who talked the loudest in front of her family. But I had carried that sentence with me through 35 years of classrooms, through widowhood, through every quiet humiliation. A family delivers to the women they assume are too old and too soft to fight back. I thought of it now, standing there with the teapot empty in my hands, watching Hong laugh at something Kai had said, watching my son stare down at his rice like he wished he were anywhere else. Still water runs deepest, I told myself. Let them see the surface. Let them think it's calm because there's nothing underneath. They had no idea what I had already started to do. The house had not always felt like a place where I needed to be careful with my own silence. I want you to understand what it was before, because the contrast matters. Before Hong, before the appraisal, before any of it, This house was simply a place where my husband and I built a life out of almost nothing, and where, even after he was gone, the room still held the shape of what we'd made together. My husband's name was Tu. Everyone called him Mr. Tu, even the neighborhood children, because he had a way of speaking to people, even very young people, as though their opinions mattered. He worked as a land registry clerk for the district for nearly 30 years, the kind of job that required patience and an almost obsessive attention to detail, qualities that, frankly, made him a difficult man to argue with and an easy man to love. We bought our land in 1987, the year after Duke was born, when the area was still mostly rice paddies, and the road into town flooded every monsoon season. We saved for years. I remember exactly how we did it, because I was the one who kept the small tin box hidden behind the rice sack, adding to it every month from my teaching salary, which in those years was barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone save for land. Tu used to tease me about the tin box. My wife, he'd say, holding up the coins I'd collected that month, thinks she can buy us a piece of Vietnam one dong at a time, and I would tell him, every single time, the same thing. One dong at a time is exactly how it's done. We bought the land in installments, 3 separate purchases over 6 years, until the boundary lines on the old surveyor's map finally connected into one continuous piece, registered jointly under both our names, the way it should be when 2 people build something together. The house came later, built slowly, room by room, as we could afford it. I remember the year we finally added the second bedroom, how Tu had carried bricks himself on weekends because we couldn't afford to hire more help. How proud he was standing in the unfinished frame of that room, sweat soaking through his shirt, grinning at me like he'd built a palace. We raised 3 children in that house. Duke was the youngest, born with his father's quiet patience, and, I would later learn, his father's tendency to avoid conflict at almost any cost. Our 2 older children moved to the city for work years ago, my daughter to Hanoi, where she manages a textile export office, and my eldest son to Da Nang, where he teaches engineering at the university. They call on holidays. They visit twice a year, sometimes less. Duke was the one who stayed close, which was why, when he married Hong 11 years ago, it felt natural that they would eventually move into the house with me. I liked Hong in the beginning. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy now to pretend I always saw something false in her, but that isn't true. She was charming in those early years, attentive in a way that flattered me. She brought me fruit from the market without being asked. She remembered the anniversary of Tu's death every year and lit incense at the altar, even when Duke forgot. She called me mother, with what seemed, at the time, like genuine warmth. It was Tu's altar that anchored everything in that house, even after he was gone. We kept it in the main room, facing the door, the way tradition required his photograph in a dark wood frame, the incense bowl that had belonged to his mother before him, a small dish for fruit that I refreshed every few days. Every morning, before the day's noise began, I would light a single stick of incense and stand there a moment, not praying exactly, just speaking to him the way I always had, telling him what the day held, asking, sometimes, what he would have done about whatever small trouble had come up. I never imagined I would one day stand in front of that altar and need his counsel about something as serious as this. For years, the rhythm of the house was gentle. Duke worked as a technician for a telecommunications company in town. Hong worked in real estate, which seemed, at first, like a sensible and even useful career. She understood paperwork. She understood land values. She could explain things to me that I, a woman who had spent her whole career grading essays rather than reading contracts, did not always understand on my own. I trusted her judgment on these matters. That trust, I would later understand, was the exact door she had been waiting for someone to leave open. The land itself, the original parcel Tu and I had bought 1 dong at a time, had grown enormously in value over the decades. Not because of anything we did, but because the city had crept steadily closer, because a new provincial road had been approved 2 years ago that would eventually run along the eastern edge of our property. None of us spoke about this much. It seemed distant, theoretical, the kind of thing that happens to land values without anyone needing to do anything about it. But Hong spoke about it, quietly, at first. In small comments over dinner about how property near new road developments tended to appreciate, comments she made while looking at her phone instead of at me, comments I dismissed at the time as simple professional habit, the way some people can't help but talk about their work. I did not yet understand that she was not making conversation. She was taking inventory. I think back now to those years of gentle routine morning incense, afternoon tea, Duke coming home tired from work, Hong cooking dinner some nights and ordering it other nights, the three of us sitting together in a house that still, despite everything, felt like the one Tu and I had built. And I wonder how I missed the moment when the warmth started to curdle into something else. But that is the nature of betrayal in a family. It rarely announces itself. It moves in quietly, the way water finds the smallest crack in a foundation. And by the time you notice the damage, it has already been working for a long time in the dark. The first time Hong tried something, I almost let it pass, entirely unnoticed. That is how carefully she had learned to disguise her intentions as helpfulness. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 months before the afternoon with the teapot, in early spring when the air still held the last chill of the dry season and the jasmine outside my window hadn't yet begun to bloom. I remember the date only because it was the anniversary of my mother's death, and I had spent the morning at the altar a little longer than usual, lighting a second stick of incense beside Tu's, thinking about the woman who had taught me that stillness could be its own kind of strength. I came into the kitchen to find Hong already there, dressed for work in a sharp blue blazer, her laptop open on the table beside a stack of papers I didn't recognize. "Mother," she said, looking up with that warm smile she'd perfected over 11 years of marriage to my son. "Good timing. I wanted to talk to you about something." She explained it carefully, the way you'd explain something to a child you didn't want to frighten. The new road development to the east of our property meant the district was conducting updated land surveys for tax assessment purposes. As someone who worked in real estate, she said, she had connections who could make sure our land was properly and fairly assessed, rather than leaving it to some random government appraiser who doesn't know the area. "I found someone good," she said. "A friend of a colleague, very experienced. He can come do an independent assessment so we have accurate numbers, just in case the district tries to undervalue us for tax purposes." It sounded reasonable. I want to be honest about that, because hindsight makes everything look more sinister than it felt in the moment. I had no reason then to doubt her. She worked in this field. She understood the language of surveys and assessments and registered deeds in a way I never had, despite living on that land for nearly 40 years. "That sounds sensible," I told her, and went to make tea. I did not think about it again until 2 weeks later, when a thin man with a nervous mustache showed up at our gate carrying a clipboard and a measuring wheel. Hong introduced him as Kai. He shook my hand too firmly, the way people do when they're trying to convince you of something before they've said a single word. He spent perhaps 40 minutes walking the property, occasionally murmuring numbers to himself, occasionally photographing the boundary markers with his phone. I offered him tea, which he declined, saying he had another appointment. I remember finding that strange, that an appraiser conducting a serious assessment of a significant piece of family land would rush through it in under an hour, would decline even a few minutes of rest, would seem, the entire time, slightly unable to meet my eyes. I did not yet have a reason to be suspicious. I had a feeling, the kind I used to get in my classroom decades ago when a student's excuse for missing homework was just a little too smooth, just a little too rehearsed. But a feeling is not evidence, and I have always tried to be a fair woman, even in my suspicions. 3 days after that, Hong brought home the written assessment. She handed it to me at the dinner table, sliding it across like a gift. "See," she said. "Now we have documentation. Real numbers. In case anyone ever tries to claim the land is worth more than it actually is for tax purposes." I read the figure at the bottom of the page. It seemed low to me, lower, certainly, than what I'd heard neighbors mention about land prices in our area over the past year, lower than what I would have guessed. simply from watching new construction creep closer to our boundary every season. But I am not a real estate professional. I am a retired literature teacher. What did I know about appraisals, about square meter calculations, about the technical language of zoning classifications that filled half the document in front of me? It seems low, I said carefully, testing the water the way I might test a student's certainty about an answer I suspected was wrong. Hong's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Just slightly, just enough that, if you had spent 35 years reading the faces of teenagers who were lying to you, you might have noticed it. Land values fluctuate, mother, she said smoothly. Kai is very thorough. He accounted for the drainage issues on the eastern section, the access road condition, things like that. It's actually a very fair number. Duke, sitting across from me, said nothing. He rarely did. In matters concerning Hong's work, he trusted her judgment in these things completely, the way I had once trusted her judgment, and I understood, watching him eat his dinner without looking up from his bowl, that whatever was happening here, my son would be of little help to me in untangling it. I folded the appraisal and set it beside my plate. Thank you for handling this, I said. I wouldn't know where to begin with these things myself. It was, I admit now, exactly the kind of thing she wanted to hear. The trusting old woman, grateful for her children's modern competence, content to sign whatever was placed in front of her, because the language of surveys and assessments belonged to a younger, more capable generation. I went to bed that night and lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, the photograph of 2 on the nightstand, catching a sliver of moonlight through the window. Something about the number on that page sat wrong in my stomach, the way a sentence sits wrong when a student has copied an answer, instead of understanding it technically correct in form, but somehow hollow underneath. I did not yet know what I was looking at. But I had spent my whole life teaching young people to read carefully, to notice what an author leaves out as much as what they put in. That appraisal had left something out. I just didn't know yet what it was. The second sign came 11 days later, and it arrived not as a document, but as a sound. The particular sound of 2 people trying to speak quietly in a house, with thin walls and old wooden floors that creaked, if you knew which boards to avoid, and groaned if you people didn't. I had gone to bed early that night, my knees aching the way they always did when the weather was about to turn, and I was lying awake in the dark, when I heard Hong's voice drift up through the floor from the room below mine, the small study, where 2 used to keep his old land registry files. The room Hong had taken over, for what she called her work corner. I could not make out every word, but I could make out enough. Just need her to sign the transfer authorization, before the siblings find out the real number. I sat up in bed. The ceiling fan clicked softly above me, the only other sound in the house, besides the wind moving through the tamarind tree outside. The same tree 2 had planted the year Duke was born, now grown tall enough to brush against the roof when the wind picked up. I could not hear who she was speaking with. Duke's voice, when it came at all, was too low and too brief to identify clearly, just murmured agreement. The same way he agreed with nearly everything Hong proposed. It might have been him on the other end of that conversation. It might have been someone else entirely, Kai, perhaps, or someone whose name I had not yet learned. The siblings find out the real number. I sat with that phrase for a long time in the dark, turning it over the way I used to turn over a difficult passage of poetry with my students, looking for what it meant beneath its surface. The real number, not the appraisal Hong had handed me at the dinner table 11 days before. A different number, a real one, as opposed to whatever the document on my kitchen table had claimed to be. And the siblings, my other 2 children, the ones in Hanoi and Da Nang, who held equal legal claim to that land as their father's heirs, who had not been consulted about any survey, any appraisal, any transfer authorization, because as far as either of them knew, nothing regarding the family land was currently in motion at all. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind in the tamarind tree, to the occasional creak of footsteps below me, to the small, ordinary sounds of a house I had lived in for almost 40 years, a house that suddenly felt less like my own, than it had felt the morning before. In the gray hour just before dawn, I rose and walked, as I always did, to the altar in the main room. I lit a single stick of incense for two, the way I had every morning for 8 years, and stood there a moment longer than usual, watching the thin gray ribbon of smoke climb toward the ceiling, bending slightly with the draft from the open window. Never breaking, never quite disappearing. "What would you do?" I asked him quietly, the way I always asked him things, if someone tried to take what we built one dong at a time. The incense did not answer. Of course. It never had. But standing there in the half-light, watching the smoke curl and bend without ever losing its thread, I thought of something else my mother used to say, a saying I had not thought of in years, but that surfaced now with startling clarity. "Tre ja mung mok," she used to tell me. "When the old bamboo dies, new shoots rise in its place." She had meant it about generations, about the natural order of children growing up to replace their parents. But standing there in the dim morning light, I understood it differently. The old bamboo does not simply vanish to make room for the new. It bends. It holds its ground through storms that would snap a weaker stalk. It only falls when something cuts it down on purpose. I was not going to fall easily. I went to the kitchen and made my tea exactly as I always did. And when Duke came downstairs an hour later, bleary-eyed, and reaching for the rice without quite looking at me, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether Hong had mentioned anything new about the land assessment. He paused, just for a half-second, a pause I would not have noticed in anyone else, but I had spent 35 years noticing exactly this kind of pause in students who were deciding, in real time, how much of the truth to give me. "No," he said, "nothing new." "Why?" I smiled at him, the way I used to smile at students. I was choosing not to corner just yet, the way I had smiled at Hong and Kai, and everyone else in that room weeks before any of this began. "No reason," I said. "Just curious." But that morning, after he left for work, I did something I had never done before in all my years of trusting other people to handle the paperwork of our lives. I took the old metal box from the back of Tu's closet, the one that held our original land documents, the deed his hands had signed 38 years ago, and I began, very slowly, very carefully, to read every single page myself. I did not yet know what I was looking for. I only knew that somewhere in those documents, or somewhere outside them, in an office I had not yet visited, or a phone call I had not yet made, the real number Hong had spoken of in the dark was waiting to be found, and that whoever had buried it there had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that a woman who spent her life teaching 17-year-olds to read between the lines would never think to read her own family's paperwork the same way. 3 weeks after I began reading through Tu's old land documents, I found the name Kai again, but not in the way I expected. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that would mean nothing to most people. I was searching through the District Land Registry Office's public records, something I'd learned to navigate after spending 2 patient afternoons there, asking quiet questions of a young clerk who reminded me, in his careful manners, of my own students decades ago. I wasn't looking for anything specific that morning. I was simply trying to understand how appraisals were normally filed, what the standard process looked like, so I could compare it to whatever Hong had arranged. What I found instead was a record of 3 other appraisals filed by the same man, Kai, all within the past 2 years, all involving land near the new provincial road development, all valued, suspiciously, at roughly 60 to 70% of what comparable parcels nearby had sold for. In each case, the seller's family name matched a buyer's name that appeared again, 18 months later, on a separate resale filing at the full market price. I sat in that small registry office, with the documents spread in front of me, the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, and I felt something settle into place the way the final piece of a long lesson plan finally clicks together after weeks of drafts. This was not a single bad appraisal. This was a method. I asked the young clerk, as casually as I could manage, who the buyer's name was on those resale filings. He checked, frowning slightly at his screen, and read me back a company name I did not recognize at first. Golden Delta Properties Investment. It took me a moment longer to place it. And when I did, my hands went still on the desk in front of me. It was Hong's company, not the real estate agency where she officially worked, the one whose name appeared on her business cards and her office door, but a smaller entity, a side venture registered under a slightly different name, one she had apparently set up 2 years earlier with a business partner whose name I also did not recognize. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty, and I understood it. The way you understand a poem's structure only after reading it 3 or 4 times, when suddenly the rhyme scheme and the imagery and the meaning all align at once. Kai produced low appraisals for land owned by families who trusted him, or who trusted the relative who had hired him. Those families, believing the low number was accurate, would sell sometimes to relatives, helping them simplify an inheritance, sometimes directly to Golden Delta Properties Investment, believing they were getting a fair deal from someone they knew. 18 months later, once the dust had settled and no one was looking too closely anymore, the land would resell at full market value, sometimes more, once the new road's effect on prices had become undeniable to even a casual observer. It was not theft committed with violence or even with outright lies. It was theft committed with paperwork, with the quiet assumption that families, especially elderly women, who had spent their lives teaching literature instead of studying contracts, would not think to ask the right questions. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of fog, the document copies folded carefully in my bag, my hands tight on the motorbike's handlebars. I kept thinking of an old saying my mother used to murmur whenever she watched the rice paddies during flood season, watching the water rise slow and patient and seemingly harmless, until, one morning, it had swallowed an entire field overnight. Nước chảy đá mòn. Flowing water wears down even stone. I had always understood it as a saying about patience, about persistence, accomplishing what brute force cannot. I understood it differently now, riding home with evidence of my own family's betrayal folded in my bag. The water Hong had been letting flow against me for months, maybe years, had not announced itself as a flood. It had moved slowly, politely, disguised as helpfulness, disguised as a daughter-in-law's competence in matters her mother-in-law didn't understand. And it had been wearing down, very patiently, the foundation of everything Tu and I had built. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Duke was still at work. Hong's car was not in the drive. I went straight to the altar, the way I always did when I needed to steady myself, and lit incense with hands that, for the first time in this entire ordeal, were not entirely steady. I stood there a long time, watching the smoke rise and bend in the afternoon, light slanting through the window, and I thought about the conversation I had overheard through the floorboards weeks before. The siblings find out the real number. I understood it now in full. The real number was not simply a higher appraisal. It was the difference between what my family was being told their inheritance was worth and what Hong intended to quietly extract from it before anyone else in the family had a chance to object. My eldest son in Da Nang, my daughter in Hanoi, their share of the land, their father's legacy, their inheritance, already being maneuvered out from under them through a company whose name they had never even heard. I set the incense down and looked at Tu's photograph, at the careful, patient expression he always wore in that picture, the same expression he wore the day we signed the final paperwork on that land, 38 years of installments finally complete, both our names on the same line. They think I won't notice, I told him quietly. They think because I taught children instead of studying contracts, I wouldn't know how to read what's underneath the numbers. The smoke curled upward, steady and silent, the way it always did, offering no answer except its own quiet persistence. I folded the documents into the metal box where Tu's original deed was kept, locked it, and placed it back in the closet exactly where it had been. Hong came home an hour later, smiling, cheerful, asking what I'd made for dinner. I told her I'd made her favorite, the braised pork with bamboo shoots, and watched her face light up with genuine pleasure. The same warmth she had always shown me, the warmth I now understood had been sitting directly on top of something else entirely. I served the food. I asked about her day. I listened to her talk about a difficult client, nodding in all the right places. And inside, beneath the calm surface I had spent a lifetime learning to maintain, something had shifted permanently. I was no longer simply suspicious. I knew. Knowing was not the same as having proof that would hold up to anyone outside my own household. And I understood that distinction better than most people might expect from a retired literature teacher. I had spent 35 years grading essays, and one thing I learned early in that career was the difference between a student who simply asserted an opinion and a student who could defend it with evidence drawn carefully from the text. Conviction without evidence convinces no one but yourself. If I confronted Hong now, with nothing but an overheard conversation and a stack of registry documents, I barely understood myself. She would simply explain it away, the same smooth, reasonable way she had explained the original appraisal, and I would be left looking like exactly what she assumed I was, a confused old woman seeing conspiracies in ordinary paperwork. So instead, I became patient, and in that patience, I discovered something I had not expected. A small, quiet pleasure in the work of it. The first thing I did was call my former student, Lam, a boy I had taught in my last decade of teaching, back when he was a serious, careful 17-year-old who used to stay after class asking questions about essay structure that most students his age didn't think to ask. He had gone on to study law and now worked as a senior clerk at the district notary office, a position that meant he understood land registration far better than I ever could on my own. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon while Hong was at work and Duke was at the office, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me. "Teacher Nguyet," he said, delight evident in his voice the moment he recognized my number. "It's been years. How are you?" I told him I was well, and then, carefully, I explained that I needed some quiet advice about a land matter. The kind of advice a person gives a former teacher rather than a formal client. Off the record, between us. He agreed without hesitation, the way good students often do for teachers who once believed in them before anyone else had reason to. Over the following 2 weeks, Lam helped me understand exactly what I was looking at. He explained how appraisal fraud schemes typically worked, how they relied on family trust and information asymmetry, how the 18-month gap between low-value purchase and full-value resale was a common pattern specifically designed to avoid triggering tax fraud investigations, which typically focused on transactions completed within a single calendar year. "You need an independent appraisal," he told me during one of our calls, his voice careful and serious in a way that reminded me, oddly, of how seriously he used to take feedback on his essays. "From someone with no connection to your family. No connection to this Kai person. Properly certified. Properly documented. If the numbers come back significantly different from what you were given, that discrepancy becomes very hard for anyone to explain away." He gave me the name of a firm 2 provinces over, one with no ties to anyone in our district, run by a woman named Mrs. Fuang, who had built her reputation specifically on independent assessments for inheritance disputes. I made the call myself, from a phone booth near the market rather than from home, an act that felt almost theatrical, until I reminded myself how carefully Hong had once gone through papers in Tu's old study without a flicker of guilt. If she could be that careful in her deception, I could be at least as careful in my investigation. Mrs. Fuang agreed to send a team the following week, scheduled deliberately for a Wednesday morning when both Hong and Duke would be at work, when the house would be empty except for me, and whatever quiet truth her measuring instruments could uncover. There is a particular satisfaction, I discovered during those 2 weeks of preparation, in moving carefully and methodically towards something you know is right, even when no one around you understands what you're doing. I imagine it is similar to the satisfaction Tu used to describe from his decades at the land registry office, the quiet pleasure of matching a messy, complicated dispute back to the clean, unambiguous truth of a properly recorded document. I continued, throughout those weeks, to play the role Hong expected of me. I asked no further questions about the appraisal. I signed nothing, But I also raised no objections, allowing her to believe the matter was settled and forgotten, that her mother-in-law had simply accepted the number on the page and moved on, as elderly women, in her estimation, apparently did. I cooked dinner every night. I tended the small vegetable garden behind the house, the one Tu had started the year he retired, the one I still kept exactly as he'd left it, rows of bitter melon and Vietnamese mint that required attention, but rewarded patience. I lit incense every morning, the same ritual, the same single stick of smoke rising and bending in the early light. And underneath all of it, quietly, methodically, I built the foundation of something Hong had not anticipated and would not see coming until it was already standing in front of her, fully formed, undeniable. There is an old expression my mother used about catfish, about how they hide patiently beneath the muddy water of a flooded field, invisible until the moment they strike, and I thought of it often during those 2 weeks, smiling slightly to myself over the dishes, over the garden, over the tea I poured for Hong every evening with hands that had learned, decades ago in front of a classroom, full of teenagers, exactly how to look calm while thinking 3 steps ahead. Cá nằm trên thớt thì biết bơi đâu. The fish on the cutting board still doesn't know which way to swim. I had always found that saying slightly cruel when I was young, the image of something already caught, already doomed, simply unaware of its own fate. I understood it differently now, watching Hong move through our house with the easy confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She had no idea, yet, which way the water was actually flowing. The Wednesday morning Mrs. Phuong's team arrived to conduct the independent appraisal passed without incident, exactly as I'd hoped, quiet, professional, finished within 3 hours, leaving no trace behind, except a folder of documents I locked away in the metal box beside Tu's original deed, and a number that confirmed, in cold and careful detail, everything Lam had warned me to expect. I did not yet know the full extent of what I was dealing with. I believed, in my naivety, that the falsified appraisal was the worst of it. I was wrong, though I would not understand how wrong for another 2 weeks. It began on an ordinary Sunday evening, the kind where the whole family gathered for dinner, a tradition Tu had insisted on throughout our marriage, and one I had maintained out of habit and a quiet, stubborn hope that some thread of the old warmth still existed beneath everything that had changed. Hong arrived at the table carrying a folder, the kind of professional leather folder she used for client documents, and set it beside her plate with a deliberate care that immediately put me on alert. Duke glanced at it too, his expression unreadable, though I noticed he didn't ask what it was, which told me he likely already knew. "Mother," Hong said, once the rice had been served, and the first few bites eaten in the usual comfortable silence, "I wanted to talk to you about something important. For your own good, really." I set down my chopsticks and waited, the way I used to wait for a student to work up the courage to confess they hadn't done the assigned reading. "You're getting older," she continued, her voice gentle, almost maternal, an irony so complete, I nearly laughed despite myself. "And managing all this paperwork, the land, the house registration, it's a lot for someone your age to keep track of. Duke and I have been talking, and we think it would be much simpler, much safer for you, if you signed power of authorization over to us, just for the property matters. Nothing else changes. You'd still live here, still be completely taken care of. We just want to protect you from making any mistakes with something this important." She opened the folder and slid a document across the table toward me, already partially filled out, my name printed neatly at the top in the space where my signature would eventually go. I looked at the document for a long moment, long enough that Hong's smile began, very slightly, to falter. This was not a clumsy attempt. This was sophisticated, patient, exactly the kind of move that would have worked on someone less careful, less prepared, someone who hadn't spent the last month quietly building a case with the help of a former student and an independent appraiser 2 provinces away. "This authorizes you to manage all transactions related to the land," I said slowly, reading the relevant clause aloud, watching her face as I did, "including sale, transfer, and subdivision. without requiring my signature on individual transactions going forward. Just to make things easier, Hong said quickly. So you don't have to be bothered every time there's paperwork. And my other children, I said. Would they need to consent to this as well, since the land is part of their father's estate? A flicker crossed her face, there, and gone so fast that anyone less practiced at reading teenagers' faces across a classroom for 35 years might have missed it entirely. It's simpler if it's just you, she said. Since you're the primary owner on record, we can update everyone else later, once things are settled. Once the land had already been quietly transferred through Golden Delta Properties investment, I understood. Once the resale at full market value had already occurred, once there was nothing left for my other children to object to, except a fait accompli, dressed up afterward, in whatever explanation Hong found convenient. I picked up the document, folded it carefully, and set it down beside my plate without signing it. I'll think about it, I said, in the same mild voice I had used for months now, the voice that had convinced her, I'm sure, that I was exactly the harmless, trusting old woman she needed me to be. Relief crossed her face, the relief of someone who has mistaken hesitation for eventual surrender. Of course, Mother, no rush. Just think it over. But there was something underneath her relief that night. A kind of barely restrained eagerness I hadn't seen from her before. As though she believed, with total confidence, that the matter was now simply a formality. A question of when, rather than if. She believed she had won. I went to bed that night, and lay awake, listening to the wind move through the tamarind tree, thinking about how close she had come to being right. If I had been the woman she assumed I was, too trusting, too unfamiliar with legal documents, too eager to make her own life easier, by signing whatever her children's spouse placed in front of her, this would already be over. The land would already be moving, quietly and legally, out of my family's hands, and into a structure designed to enrich exactly one person at everyone else's expense. I rose before dawn the next morning, earlier than usual, and went to the altar in the gray half-light. I lit incense for 2, and stood there a long time, the smoke curling upward in the still morning air, the house silent around me, except for the distant sound of a rooster somewhere down the lane. They think the water is calm, I told him quietly, the same thing I had told him weeks before, though I understood now how much further the water had actually risen since then. They don't know what's gathering beneath it. I thought of the rice fields of my childhood, how the water during flood season could look perfectly still on the surface, glassy and peaceful, while beneath that surface the current moved fast enough to sweep away anything not anchored deeply enough to withstand it. I had spent 38 years anchoring myself to that land, one dong at a time, alongside a man who had taught me, more than anyone, the patient value of doing things correctly even when no one was watching. Hong believed she had reached the final step of her plan. She had no idea that the storm she assumed she had already weathered had not even begun to arrive. The folder Lamb brought me 11 days later did not contain what I expected, and I want to be honest that nothing in my 68 years had prepared me for what I read inside it. He had called the evening before, his voice unusually careful, asking if he could come by the house the next morning instead of speaking over the phone. I knew, the moment I heard that particular carefulness in him, the same careful tone he used to use right before telling me a difficult truth about his own family struggles when he was 17, that whatever he had found was worse than anything we had uncovered so far. He arrived just after Hong and Duke left for work, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, where I had once poured tea for the appraiser Kai. The folder closed in front of him for a long moment before he finally opened it. "Teacher," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something before I show you this. What I found doesn't just confirm the appraisal fraud. It goes back further than that." He laid out a series of documents, each one a property transaction from the past 6 years, each one bearing my husband's name, or what appeared to be my husband's name, in the signature line. 2 had died 8 years ago. These transactions were dated within the last 6. I stared at the page in front of me, at the familiar, careful signature 2 had used his entire life, the same signature I had watched him sign hundreds of times across 38 years of marriage, on bank documents, on Duke's school enrollment forms, on the original deed for our land itself. It was not his signature. It was a forgery, but a skilled one, close enough that I understood immediately why no clerk at the registry office had questioned it, why it had passed through official channels without raising a single alarm. There are 4 transactions, Lamb said gently, watching my face the way you watch someone you're afraid might break. Small parcels, adjacent to your property, that were apparently sold off in pieces over the past several years, each one using forged authorization that listed your husband as still living and as co-signing alongside Hong, who held limited power of attorney from an earlier document, the one she had you sign 3 years ago, when she told you it was simply for managing utility accounts while you recovered from your knee surgery. I remembered that document. I remembered it with sudden, sickening clarity. Hong sitting beside my hospital bed, gentle and attentive, sliding a single page in front of me to sign because I couldn't easily get to the utility office myself, telling me it was a small, limited thing, nothing to worry about. I had trusted her completely in that moment. I had been in pain, grateful for her care, relieved someone was handling the small details of life I couldn't manage from a hospital bed. She had used my husband's death the way another person might use a key left carelessly in an unlocked door. She forged Tu's signature, I said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy in my mouth, to make it appear he was still alive, still co-authorizing these sales, using a power of attorney I gave her for utility bills. Yes, Lamb said quietly. I'm sorry, teacher. I know this is. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat very still at that table. The same table where Tu and I had eaten 10,000 meals together. The same table where I had once helped Duke with his school assignments by lamplight when the electricity was unreliable. The same table where, just 11 days earlier, Hong had slid an authorization document toward me and called it protection. She had not simply tried to take what was mine. She had used my husband's memory, his name, the signature I had watched him write across nearly 4 decades of partnership, as a tool to steal what remained of his legacy after he was no longer here to defend it. I thought of him on those mornings I stood before the altar, asking him quietly what he would have done, never imagining that somewhere in the official record of our land, someone had already been forging his answer. I felt something in my chest that I cannot adequately describe even now, not simply anger, though anger was certainly part of it, but something closer to grief reopened, the particular pain of losing someone twice. Once to illness 8 years ago, and once again in this moment, watching his name used as a weapon against the very things he had spent his life building. I excused myself from the table and walked, without quite deciding to, toward the altar in the main room. I stood there a long moment without lighting incense, simply looking at his photograph, at the patient, careful expression he always wore, the expression of a man who had spent 30 years at the land registry office, ensuring that paperwork told the truth. They used your name, I whispered, my voice breaking in a way it had not broken once throughout this entire ordeal. Not when Hong called me too foolish to notice. Not when I read the falsified appraisal. Not even when I first understood the scope of the fraud. They wrote your signature on paper, after you were gone, to steal from your own children. I stood there a long time, the silence of the house pressing in around me, broken only by the distant sound of the tamarind tree's branches moving in the wind outside. When I finally returned to the kitchen, Lamb was waiting patiently, the documents still spread across the table, and I understood, looking down at them again with eyes that had cleared somewhat from the worst of the grief, that what I held now was no longer simply evidence of an undervalued appraisal. It was forgery. It was theft compounded by the desecration of a dead man's name. It was, in the clearest and most undeniable terms imaginable, a crime that no amount of smooth explanation or family loyalty could talk its way around. What do you need from me? I asked Lamb quietly, my voice steady again, though something in me had shifted permanently, the way a riverbed shifts after a flood and never quite returns to its original shape. to make sure this cannot be hidden again?" He looked at me with something that resembled both sorrow and respect. "Everything you've gathered so far," he said. "Plus this. Plus one more thing, if you're prepared for it. A handwriting comparison. Certified. Comparing this signature against verified samples of your husband's actual handwriting. With that, alongside everything else, no court in this country could look away from what's been done." I thought of Tu's old letters, kept carefully in a drawer beside our bed for 8 years, his handwriting on birthday cards, on notes left for me, on the kitchen counter when he left early for work, ordinary domestic proof of a life that had been real, that had mattered, that someone now wanted to erase and rewrite for their own profit. "I have what you need," I told him, and for the first time since that afternoon, with the teapot and the cruel sentence spoken too loudly in front of an appraiser, I felt something other than grief settle over me. I felt the quiet, terrible clarity of a woman who finally understood exactly what she was fighting and exactly what she intended to do about it. I did not confront Hong the day I learned about the forged signature, nor the day after, nor for the 3 weeks that followed. I understand that this might seem strange to someone who has not yet learned the particular discipline required to wait when every instinct in your body is demanding immediate justice. But grief, I have found, makes for poor strategy, and I had not survived 68 years, had not raised 3 children, and buried a husband, and stood in front of a classroom of restless teenagers for 35 years, without learning that the moment you feel most justified in striking is often the moment you are least prepared to strike well. So instead, I gathered. Lamb arranged the handwriting analysis through a certified forensic document examiner in the provincial capital, a quiet, meticulous woman who spent 2 full days comparing the forged signatures against 11 verified samples of Tu's actual handwriting that I provided from old letters, bank documents, and Duke's elementary school report cards, where Tu had signed his acknowledgement each semester for 12 consecutive years. The conclusion, when it arrived in a sealed envelope, was unambiguous. The signatures on the 4 falsified land transactions did not match. The variance, the examiner noted in careful technical language, exceeded any reasonable allowance for natural changes in handwriting over time or under stress, and showed clear evidence of deliberate forgery based on traced reference samples. I added this to the metal box beside Tu's original deed, beside the independent appraisal from Mrs. Fuang's firm, beside the registry records Lam had helped me uncover, showing Kai's pattern of fraudulent appraisals connected to Hong's company. I also did something I had never done in my entire life, something that felt, in the doing of it, both frightening and strangely necessary. I called my eldest son in Da Nang and my daughter in Hanoi, not to alarm them, but to ask, gently, whether they remembered signing any documents in recent years related to the family land that they could not clearly recall the purpose of. My daughter remembered nothing unusual, but my eldest son paused, the same kind of pause I had learned to recognize in Duke weeks earlier, and admitted that he had signed something 2 years ago, sent to him by Hong through the mail, with a brief note explaining it was simply an administrative update required by the district registry office, nothing important, just a formality. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, whether he still had a copy. He did. When it arrived by courier 4 days later, I sat at the kitchen table and read it carefully, my reading glasses sliding down my nose the way they always did, and found exactly what I now expected to find: a partial waiver of inheritance claim on the eastern parcel of land, the same parcel adjacent to the road development, the same parcel that had been quietly sold off in pieces through forged authorization over the previous 6 years. My son had signed away his claim to land he didn't even know was being sold, believing he was completing a routine administrative form for his elderly mother's benefit. I sat with that document for a long time, feeling the full architecture of what Hong had built over the past several years finally come into complete focus, not a single act of greed, but a patient, methodical campaign, executed across years, exploiting every vulnerability our family had offered her. My grief after Tu's death, my trust during my hospital recovery, my children's distance and their willingness to sign whatever their mother sent them without close scrutiny, my own assumption that a daughter-in-law who brought me fruit from the market and remembered my husband's death anniversary could not possibly be capable of something this calculated. There is an old saying about the kind of patience that builds a house of cards, brick by careless brick, each one seeming harmless on its own until the entire structure stands fully formed and only then reveals what it actually was. But I thought, more than anything during those weeks of quiet preparation, of something my mother used to say about the behavior of water just before the monsoon truly arrives, in that strange, heavy stillness that settles over the delta in the hour before the first real rain. Not the gentle showers of early season, but the storm that floods the rice paddies and reshapes the riverbanks by morning. Trời yên trước bão. The sky grows calm before the storm. People mistake that stillness for safety. They believe, watching the unnaturally quiet sky, that the danger has passed them by, when in truth, it is only gathering, only waiting for the precise moment to arrive with its full and undeniable force. I had spent weeks now playing the part Hong expected, quiet, compliant, slow to act on the authorization document. She still believed I was simply considering at my own elderly pace. I continued tending the garden. I continued lighting incense each morning. Though now, standing before Tu's photograph, I no longer asked him quietly what he would have done. I told him, instead, what I was about to do. Death anniversary for Tu was approaching. 8 years now, the largest family gathering of the year, the one occasion when both my other children would travel home, when extended family from both sides would fill the house, when the altar would be dressed in fresh fruit and flowers, and the deepest incense smoke of the entire year would curl toward his photograph from morning until night. Hong did not know I had already arranged, through Lam, for a representative from Mrs. Fhuang's appraisal firm to attend that gathering as a guest, carrying with her the original certified report. She did not know that Lam himself would be present, not as my former student this time, but in his professional capacity, prepared to confirm the registry findings to anyone who needed official verification on the spot. She believed the gathering would proceed, as gatherings always had incense, food, quiet remembrance, followed perhaps by the gentle, final conversation about the authorization document she still expected me to sign. I stood at the altar the night before the anniversary, the metal box already prepared on the table behind me, every document organized in the order Lam and I had carefully discussed, and looked at Tu's photograph one final time before the storm I had been building for weeks finally arrived. Tomorrow, I told him quietly, everyone will know exactly what was done with your name. Outside, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the wind had gone completely still, the way it always did, my mother used to say, in the hour just before the rain finally broke. The morning of Tu's death anniversary arrived clear and bright, the kind of cloudless sky my mother always claimed was a good omen for honoring the dead, though I suspected, watching the sun climb steadily over the tamarind tree outside my window, that today's clarity had less to do with omens and more to do with what I had spent the past several weeks carefully arranging beneath its surface. By 9 o'clock, the house was full in a way it hadn't been since Tu's funeral. My daughter arrived from Hanoi the night before, tired from the long bus ride, but warm and affectionate as always, hugging me at the gate with the particular fierceness she'd inherited from her father. My eldest son drove in from Da Nang with his wife and 2 children, the house filling with the specific chaos of small grandchildren underfoot, the smell of incense, mixing with the smell of the dishes. I'd spent 2 days preparing the same braised pork Tu had loved, the same sticky rice with mung bean, the same fruit arranged in careful pyramids for the altar. Hong moved through the morning exactly as I expected, gracious and attentive in front of the extended family, refilling teacups, accepting compliments on the spread of food, glancing occasionally toward me with the particular warmth of someone who believed the largest obstacle in her plan, my hesitation over the authorization document, would be resolved soon enough. perhaps even today, in the soft, sentimental atmosphere of a family gathered to honor the dead. She had no idea that two of the guests arriving that morning were not there simply to honor two. Mrs. Fwang arrived just before noon, dressed modestly, introduced by me to the gathered family as an old friend from my teaching days, a small lie that bought her enough quiet credibility to move through the house unremarked upon. Lam arrived shortly after, greeted warmly by several relatives who remembered him fondly as my former student, now grown into a respected young professional, his presence at the gathering seeming, to everyone but me, like nothing more than a former student paying respects to a beloved teacher's late husband. The ceremony itself unfolded the way it always did. We gathered before the altar as a family, incense lit in careful rows, the smoke rising thick and fragrant in the late morning light, filling the room with that particular scent I associated with every important moment of my life for the past 40 years. My eldest son led the prayers, the way the oldest child traditionally does, his voice steady and respectful as he spoke to his father's photograph, thanking him for the life he'd given us, for the land, for the house, for everything that remained of him in the world that continued without him. I watched Hong during the prayers, standing beside Duke with her head bowed in apparent reverence, and felt something cold and clear settle over me, the particular steadiness I imagine surgeons must feel in the moment just before the first incision. The meal that followed was loud and warm, full of the ordinary chaos of a large Vietnamese family gathering, children running between adult conversations, old stories repeated and laughed at again, the specific comfort of a house full of people who had once all lived under the same roof. It was after the meal, as the afternoon settled into its slower rhythm, that I rose from my seat and asked, quietly but clearly enough for the room to hear, if everyone would gather once more before the altar. "There's something I need to share with the family," I said, "while we're all together, and while your father is here with us." The room quieted, the way rooms do when an elderly matriarch makes an unusual request. Hong's expression flickered, just slightly, the same flicker I had learned to recognize months ago, though she recovered quickly, smiling, assuming perhaps that I had finally decided to announce my decision about the authorization document. I asked Duke to bring me the metal box from Tu's closet. He did so without question, setting it on the low table in front of the altar, and I opened it slowly, deliberately, in front of the entire gathered family, the way I once opened an exam, to read the first question aloud to a room full of nervous students. 8 years ago, I began, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Your father left us this land, this house, everything we built together over nearly 40 years. I want every one of you to understand exactly what has happened to that inheritance since he's been gone. I laid out the documents one by one, the way Lam and I had carefully planned. The original appraisal Kai had produced, with its suspiciously low number, Mrs. Fwang's independent assessment, showing the true value, nearly 3 times higher. The registry records showing the pattern of similar transactions connected to a company called Golden Delta Properties Investment. I watched my eldest son's face change as he recognized the name, as he realized this was the same company that had purchased a parcel of land using the authorization he himself had unknowingly signed 2 years before. "Mother," Hong said, her voice tight, the warmth gone from it entirely now. "I don't understand what you're—" "I'm not finished," I said, in the same mild, even voice I had used for months. The voice that had convinced her, for so long, that I posed no threat at all. I produced the final documents, the forged transaction records, my husband's name on signatures he never wrote, and beside them, the certified forensic comparison, confirming what I already knew with absolute certainty. The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft crackle of incense burning down to its final inch. "Your father has been dead for 8 years, I said, looking directly at Hong now, my voice finally carrying the full weight of everything I had been holding back for months. "And in that time, someone forged his signature on at least 4 separate land transactions, using a power of attorney I signed believing it was limited to utility bills while I recovered from surgery. They sold pieces of this family's land, using a dead man's name, to a company they themselves controlled, at a fraction of its real value, before reselling it at full price 18 months later. Hong's face had gone the color of ash. "That's not," she started. But Lam stepped forward then, calm and professional, introducing himself properly to the family. Not as my former student, but as a certified land registry official, and confirmed, in clear, careful language that left no room for doubt, that every document I had just shown them had been independently verified. "She's just a teacher," Hong had said. Months ago, in this exact room, in front of an appraiser she had hired to deceive me, certain that her mother-in-law would never recognize the architecture of her own betrayal. She won't know the difference. I looked at her now, standing pale and exposed before the entire gathered family, before her own husband's stunned and horrified face, before the altar of the man whose name she had used as a weapon against his own children. "I taught literature for 35 years, I said quietly. "I spent my whole career teaching young people to read what's underneath the words on a page. You assumed that skill ended when I left the classroom." The incense had burned down completely now, the last thread of smoke dissolving into the still afternoon air. And in its place, finally, stood nothing but the truth, laid bare in front of everyone who needed to see it. What happened next unfolded with a speed that surprised even me, though I suppose I should have expected it. Betrayal, once exposed, rarely holds together quietly. It shatters, and the shards cut in directions no one, not even the person who built the deception, can fully control. Duke was the first to break the silence, and watching my son's face in that moment, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Amid everything else, a small, aching relief that he had not known, that whatever else had gone wrong in our family, my youngest son had not been complicit in forging his own father's signature. "Is this true?" he asked Hong, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried through the silent room with terrible clarity. "Did you forge my father's name?" Hong's composure, the careful, professional warmth she had maintained for 11 years in this family, finally cracked entirely. "I was protecting our future," she said, her voice rising, defensive in a way that confirmed, more than any document could, exactly what she had done. "Do you know what that land is going to be worth once the road is finished? I was securing something for us, for our children someday, before your mother could be talked into giving it all away to your siblings, or some charity." "You forged my father's signature," Duke said again, louder this time, the words landing like something physical in the quiet room. "You used a dead man's name to steal from his own children." "I didn't steal anything that wasn't going to be ours eventually anyway," Hong snapped, and in that single sentence, delivered in anger, in front of the entire family, she revealed something even more damning than any document I had produced. The complete absence of remorse. The conviction that what belonged to all three of Tu's children somehow already belonged, by some private logic only she believed in, to her alone. My eldest son stood slowly, his face hard in a way I had rarely seen from him. A gentleness, usually so deeply embedded in his nature, that this transformation startled even me. "I signed something 2 years ago," he said, looking at Hong with an expression I can only describe as betrayed disbelief. "You told me it was an administrative formality. You told me it was nothing important." "It wasn't important," Hong said, though her voice had begun to waver now, the first crack of genuine fear entering what had until moments ago been pure defensive anger. "It was just paperwork. Nobody was hurt." "Nobody was hurt?" My daughter's voice, quiet until now, finally entered the conversation, sharp with a fury I had heard from her only once before, the year a colleague had tried to take credit for her work at the export office. "You forged our father's signature on documents that gave away land that belonged to all of us. You manipulated my brother into signing away his inheritance without even telling him what he was signing." Mrs. Fuang, standing quietly near the back of the room throughout this entire unraveling, finally spoke, her voice calm and measured in contrast to the rising chaos around her. "I should clarify, for everyone's understanding, that what's being described here meets the legal definition of inheritance, fraud, and document forgery, both serious criminal offenses under current law. The discrepancy between the falsified appraisal and the certified independent valuation alone represents financial damages well into the hundreds of millions of dong. Lam added, gently but firmly, that as a registry official, he was now obligated to file a formal report regarding the forged documents, a process that would likely result in the original fraudulent transactions being legally reversed. The land returned to its proper inheritance structure, and Hong herself facing formal criminal investigation. Duke, my quiet, conflict-avoidant son, who had spent 11 years deferring to his wife's judgment in nearly every matter, finally turned to her with an expression of complete and devastating clarity. "How long?" he asked, his voice now eerily calm. "Has this been going on?" Hong did not answer immediately, and that silence, more than anything else in the entire confrontation, told everyone in the room exactly how long it had truly been. 6 years, she finally admitted, the words barely audible. "Since shortly after your father died." A collective sound moved through the room, something between a gasp and a groan. The sound of an entire family, recalculating, in real time, everything they thought they understood about the woman who had sat at their table for 11 years, who had brought fruit to her mother-in-law, who had remembered the anniversary of a death she had been quietly profiting from the entire time. "I want a divorce," Duke said, and though his voice shook slightly, there was no hesitation in it, no softening. I won't stay married to someone who did this. To my father, to my own family." Hong's face crumpled then. The careful composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, finally collapsing entirely. Though I noticed, even in that collapse, that her tears seemed directed more toward the consequences now arriving than toward any genuine remorse for what she had done. "Duke, please," she said, reaching for him. "I did this for us, for our future." He stepped back from her hand, and the gesture, small as it was, seemed to mark the precise moment everything between them ended. Kai's name came up shortly after, my eldest son asking, with quiet fury, who else had been involved in this scheme, and I watched Hong's face as she realized, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of what she now faced, not simply an uncomfortable family confrontation, but formal criminal charges, a forensic investigation into years of fraudulent transactions, the unraveling of a business partnership with a man who would have every incentive, once questioned by authorities, to protect himself by fully implicating her. She had built her entire scheme on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see it. She had not built any contingency for what happens when every piece of that careful architecture is laid out simultaneously, in front of every person it was designed to deceive, with no possibility of controlling the narrative any longer. I stood near the altar throughout all of it, watching the family I had raised, and the family Hong had married into finally collide with the truth. And I felt, beneath the sorrow of watching my son's marriage collapse in front of me, something that was not quite triumph, but close to it, the particular satisfaction of watching a structure built entirely on deception, finally meet the simple, undeniable weight of evidence it could not survive. The incense had long since burned out. The afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, casting long shadows across the room where, just hours earlier, we had all knelt together honoring a dead man's memory. He had not been forgotten, I thought. Watching Hong gather her things with shaking hands while Duke refused to look at her. He had simply, finally, been allowed to speak. The legal process that followed took the better part of a year, though I will not dwell on its details here, because the truth is that the courtroom proceedings, the formal charges against Hong and Kai, the eventual restitution, ordered by the district court, none of that was ever really the point. What mattered happened in the months after, in the quiet, ordinary rebuilding of a family that had nearly lost itself entirely to one person's careful, patient greed. Duke finalized his divorce 6 months after that anniversary gathering. It was not an easy process, and I will not pretend the year that followed was anything but difficult for him. The particular grief of losing a marriage built on years of trust that turned out to have been hollow underneath The slow work of learning to trust his own judgment again, after discovering how thoroughly it had been manipulated. He moved into the smaller house on the western edge of our property, the one Tu and I had built originally for his grandmother, renovating it slowly over the following year with his own hands. The same patient, careful way his father used to work. The land itself was restored, piece by piece. Through the legal process, Lamb guided us through with the same careful diligence he'd once brought to his schoolwork decades earlier. The 4 parcels sold through forged authorization were returned to the family estate, the fraudulent transactions formally voided by the district court. The independent appraisal Mrs. Fuang had conducted became, in the end, the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, a quiet, methodical document that proved more powerful than any argument, any accusation, any raised voice could have been. I did not become wealthy from any of this. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to imagine this story ending with some dramatic financial windfall, the satisfying reversal of fortune that makes for a tidy conclusion. That is not what happened. What happened was simpler, and in its own way, more meaningful. The land that had always belonged to our family was finally, properly divided exactly as Tu and I had always intended, equally, between our 3 children, with my own name remaining on the portion that included this house, this altar, this garden I had tended every season since his retirement. My eldest son in Da Nang received his rightful share. The parcel his signature had been fraudulently used to give away, restored to him with a formal letter of apology from the district registry office for the oversight that had allowed the original forgery to pass undetected for so long. My daughter in Hanoi, though she had not been directly targeted by the scheme, insisted on a formal accounting of the entire estate going forward, a request I granted gladly, understanding now, more than ever, the value of transparency among people who claim to love each other. Kai's appraisal license was revoked permanently. He faced criminal charges alongside Hong, though as Lam had predicted, he moved quickly to cooperate with investigators. Once he understood the weight of evidence against him, providing testimony that further confirmed the scope and duration of the scheme. Hong, in the end, received a suspended sentence alongside substantial financial penalties, the court taking into account her cooperation once the case against her became undeniable, along with the absence of any prior criminal history. I did not attend most of the proceedings myself. I had no desire to watch the slow, grinding machinery of justice work through what I already knew to be true. I had said what needed saying. On that afternoon before Tu's altar, in front of the family she had spent 6 years deceiving. The courts could handle the rest. I think of her sometimes, even now, not with anger exactly, though anger was certainly present for a long while after everything came to light. What I feel now, more than anything, is a kind of weary sorrow, the particular grief of having let someone close enough to do this kind of damage, alongside the quiet recognition that her choices, in the end, belonged entirely to her, not to me, not to anything. I failed to see clearly enough, or soon enough. I still rise every morning before the rest of the household wakes, the way I have for nearly 40 years now, and walk to the altar where Tu's photograph watches over the main room with that same patient, careful expression he wore throughout our entire life together. I light a single stick of incense, the way I always have, and stand there a moment, in the quiet, watching the thin gray smoke climb toward the ceiling, bending slightly with the morning draft, never breaking, never quite disappearing. Some mornings I tell him about the grandchildren, about Duke's slow, steady progress in the small renovated house, about my daughter's recent promotion at the export office, about the bitter melon finally ready for harvest in the garden he planted the year he retired. Other mornings, I simply stand there in silence, the way I did for 8 years before any of this began, before a careless sentence spoken too loudly in front of an appraiser revealed the full architecture of what had been quietly happening beneath the surface of our family for years. I think often, on these quiet mornings, of something my own mother used to tell me. sitting on the porch of our old house in the Delta when I was young enough to still believe that loud, confident people were always the ones worth trusting, that quiet women had less to offer than they let on. Nước sâu thì lặng. Still water runs deepest. I understand it now in a way I never fully did when I was 19 and newly engaged, listening to my mother explain how to choose a partner wisely. It is not simply about choosing quiet people to trust. It is about understanding that stillness on the surface tells you nothing about what moves beneath it, that the people who seem least capable of fighting back are sometimes the very ones who have spent their entire lives learning exactly how and exactly when to do so. I am 69 years old now. I have buried a husband, weathered a daughter-in-law's betrayal, watched my son's marriage collapse, and slowly rebuild itself into something new and honest. I have stood, more than once, at the edge of losing everything too, and I spent 38 years building, one dong at a time, season after patient season. But I am still here. The land is still ours, divided properly now among the children it was always meant for. The altar still stands in the main room, facing the door, exactly as tradition requires, and every morning, the incense still rises in that same thin, steady thread of smoke, bending gently with the wind, never breaking. Still, water runs deepest, my mother used to say. I have learned, in the years since, that it also runs the longest, and that it remembers, with perfect clarity, exactly where it is going. If you're an older parent who has ever felt invisible at your own dinner table, dismissed as too old to understand what's really going on around you, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Quiet does not mean weak, and trusting does not mean foolish. The people who raised a family, built a home, and worked a lifetime to leave something behind deserve to be heard, not managed. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply refuse to be underestimated. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep telling stories like this one. Has anyone in your own life ever assumed you were too trusting, too old, or too out of touch to notice what was really happening around you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below.